The morning Rebecca Covington walked into Sutton Ranch with her chin lifted and her hands balled at her sides. There was not a single soul in Caldwell, Kansas, who believed she would last a week. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kisham Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, bold and a little reckless, smelling of cattle dust and ambition. The trail drives were coming through again, bringing with them cowboys from Texas who spent their wages in 3 days and moved on, leaving the town simultaneously richer and more tired. Caldwell was a hard place, beautiful in the way of things that have never been tamed, and it did not make room easily for people who needed it too. Rebecca Covington was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 4 months. Her husband, Thomas Covington, had died of a fever in February, leaving her with a 7-year-old daughter named Clara, a small house at the edge of town that was more debt than shelter, and a reputation as a woman who had once been comfortable. Thomas had not been a bad man. He had been a land surveyor with good intentions and poor planning, and when he died, Rebecca discovered that the life they had built together was more borrowed than owned. The bank held papers on the house. Thomas's brother in Missouri had loaned them money that he now wanted returned. The comfortable life Rebecca had worn like a coat turned out to be made of paper, and it dissolved in the first rain of grief. She had spent the first month trying to solve the problem quietly, the way women were expected to. She had sewn, taking in mending from neighbors, charging what she dared and charging less than she should have. She had sold 2 pieces of furniture and a set of china that had belonged to her mother. She had accepted 3 casseroles and a ham from church women who looked at her with that particular blend of sympathy and relief that meant they were glad it was her and not them. She had thanked them with her full composure and eaten the food and cried in private. By the 2nd month, she understood that sewing would not save her. The numbers were too simple and too brutal. The bank had given her until September, which was 6 months from the date of Thomas's death. After that, she and Clara would lose the house. Rebecca was not a woman who panicked easily, but she was a woman who looked at facts with her full attention, and the facts told her that she needed real wages, and she needed them soon. The problem was that Caldwell in 1878 did not offer women many avenues to real wages. She could teach at the schoolhouse, but the position was filled and the schoolteacher, Miss Harmon, looked to be in excellent health. She could cook at one of the eating houses, but the wages were barely better than sewing, and the hours meant she would never see Clara. She could take in boarders, but the house was too small and repairs on the roof meant she would spend more than she made. She had considered briefly moving to Wichita or Dodge City where there might be more options, but she had no money for a move and Clara had already lost her father, and Rebecca was not willing to pull her from her schoolmates too. It was the dry goods owner, Mr. Abernathy, who had said it without quite meaning to be helpful. He had been commiserating with her over the counter while she bought flour on credit she was not sure she could repay, saying what a shame it was and how hard times were, when he mentioned almost in passing that Cornelius Sutton was looking to hire on at his ranch. Lost his cook when the man rode off to Colorado. Cook and general household help both. The pay was good because Sutton paid fair, always had. But of course, Mr. Abernathy had added with that particular tone men used when they meant to be kind but were really being limiting. It was rough work and not the sort of thing a woman in Rebecca's position would want. Rebecca had looked at Mr. Abernathy for a long moment. Then she had taken her flour, thanked him, and walked out of the store. She stood on the boardwalk in the spring sunshine, Clara's hand in hers, and she made a decision. The next morning she left Clara with her neighbor, Mrs. Pratt, who was a decent woman with a house full of children who barely noticed one more, and she walked to Sutton Ranch. The ranch was 2 miles east of town, set back from the road behind a fence line that had been mended recently and a gate that stood straight. This meant something, Rebecca noted. A ranch where fences were kept was a ranch that was actually being run. She had learned more about land and livestock in her marriage to Thomas than people expected, because Thomas had always talked through his surveys with her, and because Rebecca had always been curious about the land he mapped. She knew what a well-kept property looked like, and this one was. The main house was a two-story frame structure with a covered porch, painted white though the paint was peeling at the edges in a way that suggested it had been done some years ago and not repeated. There was a barn, two outbuildings, a bunkhouse set off to the left, and a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that had been turned but not yet planted. A dog came to meet her at the gate, old and orange-colored, and it sniffed her hand and wagged once and returned to the shade. Two cowboys were working near the barn, watching her with open curiosity as she came up the path. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the front porch, where a man had come to stand. Cornelius Sutton was 33 years old, and he was the kind of man who looked like the land had made him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life, rather than the way of a man who had simply been built large, and there was a weatheredness to him that stopped short of roughness. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw was clean-shaved that morning, which suggested he had not given up on civilization entirely. He wore a plain work shirt and trail-worn trousers, and he was looking at Rebecca with an expression she could not immediately read because it was complicated, part surprise, part wariness, and part something she did not yet have a name for. He had bought the ranch 7 years ago with money he had earned on 3 cattle drives, and saved with the discipline of a man who had grown up poor enough to know exactly what it felt like. He ran 300 head, paid his 4 hands fair wages and on time, and he was known in Caldwell as a man whose word was worth something. He was also known, though people said this more quietly, as a man who kept to himself. He had never married. This was not from lack of opportunity but from lack of attention, the way some men are so focused on one thing that everything else simply does not find purchase. He watched Rebecca Covington walk up his path and something shifted in him, something he would not be able to name clearly for quite some time. "Mr. Sutton," she said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. She did not climb them uninvited. She had rehearsed this on the walk over, rehearsed it carefully, and now she delivered it as if she had always been capable of delivering it, which was true though she had not always known it. "My name is Rebecca Covington. I understand you are looking for a cook and household help. I am here to apply for the position." Cornelius Sutton looked at her for a moment. She was a woman of medium height with dark auburn hair pulled back severely under a plain bonnet. She had light brown eyes that were direct and clear, and a face that was pretty in the way of things that are well-made rather than decorative. She was thin, the kind of thin that said she had not been eating enough, though she held herself in a way that would not admit it. She was wearing a dress that had been washed many times and pressed with careful attention, and her hands at her sides were steady. He had been expecting one of the Mexican families from south of town, or perhaps a young man looking for work. He had not been expecting this. "Mrs. Covington," he said, his voice was low and unhurried, "I appreciate you coming out, but the work here is rough, early hours, long days. The kitchen is plain and the hands are not always quiet." "I have been awake before sunrise for 8 years, Mr. Sutton," Rebecca said. "I can cook for 12 if needed, I can manage a household budget, and I can work whatever hours the ranch requires. I am not looking for charity. I am looking for wages in exchange for work, and I will give you full value for whatever you pay." He studied her another moment. One of the cowboys near the barn, a young man named Pete with a gap where his front tooth should have been, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Cornelius turned his head very slightly in Pete's direction and the sound stopped. "What wages are you asking?" he said. She had thought about this carefully. She named a figure. It was fair, not generous, exactly what the work was worth if done properly. Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "Come in and I will show you the kitchen," he said. "Then you can tell me if you still want the position." She climbed the steps and walked past him into the house. The kitchen was not bad. It was large enough, with a good cast iron range that needed a thorough cleaning, a dry sink, open shelving that had not been organized in some time, and a back door that opened onto the kitchen garden. The floor needed scrubbing. The shelves needed ordering. The pantry, when she opened the door, made her press her lips together because it was a study in bachelor chaos. Tins without labels stacked beside bags that had not been properly sealed, flour that had gone to weevils, coffee beans running loose in a corner. "I see," she said. "It has been a few weeks since the last cook left," Cornelius said from the doorway, watching her take inventory. "I will need to replace the flour and a few other things from town," she said. "I can have you a list by tomorrow. If you pay for supplies, I will account for every penny." He almost said he trusted her and then caught himself because he had only just met her. Instead he said, "That is fine." She turned and looked at him. "Then I accept the position if you are still offering it." He was. He held out his hand and she shook it, and it was the first time they touched, a firm, businesslike handshake between two people who were both pretending, quite convincingly, that this was simply a transaction. She started the following Monday. The first week was an education for everyone concerned. Rebecca arrived each morning before 6, having arranged with Mrs. Pratt to look after Clara during the day in exchange for Rebecca mending the Pratt family's clothes in the evenings. It was an arrangement that cost her hours she did not have, but it was the only one available and she made it work. She walked the 2 miles each way without complaint, though by the end of the week her feet had told her, in terms that could not be argued with, that she would need new boots soon. The 4 ranch hands, Pete and a quiet older man called Dutch and 2 brothers from Texas named Fowler and Hank, received her with varying degrees of awkwardness. Pete was young enough to be embarrassed and cover it with extra politeness. Dutch, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, assessed her once with flat gray eyes and then nodded once and never gave her any trouble at all. The Fowler brothers were simply confused, as if a woman appearing in their kitchen was a philosophical problem they had not been equipped to solve. The cooking was the easy part. Rebecca could cook. She had always cooked, and she understood instinctively how to scale up for a crew of hungry men coming in from outdoor work. By the 3rd morning, she was producing biscuits and salt pork and gravy that made Pete close his eyes and say something reverent under his breath that was not quite a prayer. By the end of the first week, the hands were coming to breakfast earlier than they needed to and lingering over coffee longer than was strictly necessary. And Dutch, who apparently never complimented anything, said that the bread was adequate, which Rebecca was told was extraordinary praise. Cornelius Sutton ate his meals at the table with his hands, which she had not expected. On some ranches, the owner ate separately. He came in each morning already working, the dust of the yard on his boots, and he sat at the head of the table and ate quietly and said thank you when he was done, and then he went back to work. He did not hover. He did not interfere. He did not treat her as either a curiosity or an ornament, which she noticed and appreciated. What he did do on the 3rd day was come into the kitchen at midday when she was alone writing the pantry shelves, and stand in the doorway watching her work until she became aware of him and turned around. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Sutton?" she said. "I wanted to say that the food has been good," he said. He seemed to find this statement uncomfortable, as if complimenting someone required muscles he had not been using. "Thank you," she said. "That is what you are paying me for." There was a pause. He looked at the reorganized shelves. "You relabeled everything. The labels were wrong or missing on half the tins. It is easier to cook when you know what you have." "That is reasonable," he said. Another pause. "Mrs. Covington, do you ride?" She blinked. It was not what she had expected. "Some," she said. "I have not ridden regularly in several years. There is a mare in the 2nd stall, gentle animal, named Bess. You are welcome to use her to get to and from the ranch. 2 miles on foot in this heat will wear you down." Rebecca looked at him. She understood immediately what this was. It was practical. It was also, and she could see him choosing not to frame it this way, a kindness. He was offering it as a practical matter so that she would not have to receive it as charity, which, given their first conversation, suggested he had been paying attention. "I appreciate the practicality of that arrangement," she said, carefully. The corner of his mouth moved, the closest thing to a smile she had yet seen from him. "Good," he said, and left. She stood alone in the pantry for a moment with her hands around a tin of baking powder, and something warm moving through her chest that she told herself was simply gratitude. The second week brought the first real disagreement. It happened because Rebecca discovered, while reviewing the household accounts that Cornelius had handed over to her management without comment, that he had been overpaying for supplies at Abernathy's dry goods. Not dramatically, but consistently, in the way that happened when a man bought things without negotiating and without keeping close track. She mentioned it at the end of a working day, showing him the figures she had written out in the clear ledger hand Thomas had always complimented. Cornelius looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Abernathy has been my supplier for 6 years," he said, "and in those 6 years he has charged you approximately 12% more than fair market price for coffee, flour, and cornmeal," Rebecca said. "I verified it against the prices at Donnelly's trading post. I can show you. Abernathy and I have an understanding." "You have an understanding," Rebecca said. "He has a profit margin." The silence that followed had a specific quality to it, the silence of a man who was not used to being contradicted and who was working through whether he was annoyed or not. She watched him and did not back down from the figures or from his gaze, and after a moment something shifted in his expression. "You would go to Donnelly's instead," he said. "I would go to Donnelly's for staples and continue to use Abernathy for specialty items where his prices are comparable," she said. "It is not about preference. It is about the ranch's money." "It is my money," he said. "Yes," she said, "which is exactly why I thought you would want to know you were spending more of it than necessary." Another silence. Then he looked back at the ledger and said, "Show me the comparison." She showed him. He studied it in the way he seemed to do everything, quietly and with complete attention. Then he closed the ledger and handed it back to her. "Use your judgment," he said, "on supplies." "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me," he said. "You were right. I dislike being wrong, but I dislike waste more." She noted this about him. It was the kind of honesty that was rare and worth paying attention to. The second week also brought Clara. Rebecca had not intended to bring her daughter to the ranch, but on the Wednesday of the second week, Mrs. Pratt's youngest came down with a chest cold bad enough that the doctor advised keeping visitors away, which meant Clara could not stay there. Rebecca had no other arrangement. She arrived that morning with Clara at her side, the little girl solemn and wide-eyed, wearing her second-best dress because Rebecca had made her change from her best. Rebecca explained the situation to Cornelius at the back door before she even took her coat off. She did not apologize for it. She explained it as a fact requiring a solution, and said that Clara would sit quietly and not be a disruption, and that she would keep to the kitchen and garden. Cornelius looked down at Clara. Clara looked up at Cornelius. She had her mother's directness and none of her mother's caution, which was the privilege of 7 years old. "Are you the cowboy who lives here?" Clara asked. "I am," Cornelius said. "Mama says you have horses. I have several. Can I see them?" "Clara," Rebecca said. "Later perhaps," Cornelius said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a dismissal. He looked at Rebecca. "She can stay." He went to work. Rebecca went to the kitchen. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of chalk and a small board that Rebecca had brought for exactly this purpose, drawing what she announced were horses, though they looked more like misshapen furniture. At midday, when the hands came in for dinner, Clara watched them with the focused attention of a small scientist. Pete, who was 22 and had younger sisters, immediately began making faces at her across the table until she dissolved into giggles, which made Dutch look at Pete with the particular expression usually reserved for rain before a roundup. The Fowler brothers, confused as always, simply pretended she was not there, which Clara did not seem to mind because she was busy stealing an extra biscuit when she thought no one was looking. Cornelius came in last, as always, and sat down, and Clara looked at him across the table with her serious brown eyes. "Mama made apple preserves," Clara announced. "She put them on the biscuits this morning and they were the best ones." "Is that so?" Cornelius said. "She makes very good things," Clara said in the tone of a person presenting credentials. "She made me a cake for my birthday that had rosewater in it. I do not really like rosewater, but the cake was still good." Cornelius looked at Rebecca, who was setting down a bowl of stew and trying not to smile. "How old were you?" he asked Clara. 7, Clara said. "Last November. Papa was sick by then, but he still sat at the table for the cake." She said this simply, without weight, the way children sometimes can, and the simplicity of it landed quietly in the room. "He is in heaven now," she added helpfully. "I am sorry to hear that," Cornelius said. "Mama says he can see us from there," Clara said, and then picked up her fork and began to eat, satisfied that the subject had been fully addressed. Rebecca sat down at the small side table where she usually ate and did not look at anyone. Cornelius ate his stew. After dinner, when the hands had gone back out and Clara was dozing on a folded blanket in the corner of the kitchen, Cornelius came back through the kitchen on his way to the barn and stopped. "Mrs. Covington," he said, low enough not to wake Clara, "if Mrs. Pratt's child remains ill, your daughter is welcome here until the arrangement is resolved." Rebecca turned from the stove. "That is not necessary," she said. "I know it is not necessary," he said. "I said she was welcome. That is a different thing." She looked at him. There it was again, that careful distinction he made, the difference between need and welcome, between charity and genuine offer. She did not know yet if he was aware he was doing it, this consistent, quiet effort to offer things in ways that left her dignity intact. She suspected he was doing it consciously, which made her respect him considerably. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went out to the barn. The third week was when the ranch hands began to notice things that they kept to themselves with varying degrees of success. Pete noticed first, because Pete was young and romantic and therefore attuned to these things. He noticed that Cornelius, who normally ate in 3 minutes flat and left without ceremony, had been taking longer at breakfast. He noticed that Cornelius asked Mrs. Covington about the kitchen garden she had started in the turned bed along the south wall, and that the question was longer than it needed to be, and the answer was listened to more carefully than strictly required. He noticed that when one of the supply wagon deliveries left a heavy crate at the back gate, Cornelius appeared from the barn to carry it in without being asked, which was not the kind of thing that happened by coincidence. Pete said nothing to Dutch because Dutch would have told him to mind his business. He said something to Hank Fowler, who frowned and said he did not see it, which Pete thought said everything about Hank Fowler's powers of observation. Dutch, who said nothing to anyone, saw it earlier than Pete did and thought about it in the evenings sitting on the bunkhouse steps with his pipe. He had known Cornelius Sutton for 4 years, and he had never seen the man in any hurry to leave his own kitchen after a meal. He considered this without judgment. He was old enough to know that a man deciding to be changed by someone was not something you could prevent or speed up, only witness. He smoked his pipe and let it be. For her own part, Rebecca was not thinking about Cornelius Sutton in those terms. She was thinking about the bank and the mortgage, and whether the wages she was earning would be enough, calculating in her head on the walk home each evening. She was thinking about Clara and about the roof, and about whether she could get through August with enough saved to make the September payment. She was thinking about her sewing pile and her aching feet, and the fact that the baking powder was running low again. She was not thinking about the way Cornelius had looked at the kitchen garden when she explained what she was planting and why, with the complete focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in what she was saying. She was not thinking about that. Not until the Thursday evening of the third week, when she was leaving late because she had stayed to do a thorough inventory, and she found him at the gate with Bess already saddled. "It is getting dark faster," he said, by way of explanation. She looked at him. He was holding the reins and looking at the middle distance with the focused neutrality of a man who had decided something and was slightly embarrassed about it. You saddled her, Rebecca said. She needed the exercise anyway. Mr. Sutton. He turned and looked at her, and they looked at each other for a moment in the late afternoon light that was going gold over the Kansas prairie, and something passed between them that was not about horses at all. "Thank you," she said. She took the reins and mounted and rode home, and she thought about it the whole way, which she told herself was only natural and meant nothing. The end of the third week brought trouble of the practical kind, which was the kind most suited to the time and place. A herd came through on the Kishom Trail, a big one out of Texas, and the trail boss wanted to water them at the creek that ran along the south edge of Sutton's property. This was not unusual. It was also not strictly Cornelius's creek to deny, since the trail rights had been negotiated into Kansas law, and the creek was considered accessible for trail herds. But the last herd that had watered there had left the bank churned to mud and taken down 20 feet of fence when the cattle pushed through at the crossing, and Cornelius had rebuilt that fence himself and was not inclined to do it again. Rebecca learned about this because she arrived on the Monday morning of the fourth week to find Cornelius already out at the south fence line before 6 in the morning, and she got the full account from Pete while she made biscuits. "Boss is fixing to have words with the trail boss," Pete said, with the relish of someone who enjoyed the prospect of confrontation only when it did not involve him. "Is that going to become a problem?" Rebecca asked. "Might be, if the trail boss is the sort who does not like words. Last summer there was an outfit that tried to push through without asking, and the boss held them off at the fence until they agreed to pay for damages. Took most of the morning." Pete paused. "Trail bosses do not like being told no. Makes them creative." Rebecca set the biscuits to bake and did not say anything else, but she moved the breakfast timing earlier so that when Cornelius came in, if he came in, there would be hot food and not cold waiting. It was a small thing. She did it without thinking about why. He came in at 7, dusty, and with the set look of a man who had held a line and knew he would have to hold it again. The trail boss had agreed to take the herd to the lower crossing 2 miles south, but it had not been an easy agreement, and the air around Cornelius had the quality of something still simmering. He sat down. She put biscuits and coffee and fried eggs in front of him without comment. He ate. The simmering slowly subsided. "The south fence needs 2 new posts before next week," he said eventually. "I will get to it Thursday." "Pete mentioned the crossing problem," she said, refilling his coffee. "Pete talks too much. He said you held them off last summer, too." "Last summer they had already damaged the fence before I got there. This year I got there first." He paused. "The trail rights are clear. I am not trying to block the trail. I am trying to protect my fence and my creek bank, and there is a right way to do both." "It sounds like you managed it properly," she said. He looked up at her, slightly surprised, as if he had expected something other than straightforward agreement. "It is my land," he said. "It is," she said, "and you were right to hold to that." There was a pause. He picked up his coffee cup. "How is the garden coming?" he asked, and it was such a deliberate change of subject, so clearly a choice to move toward something quieter, that she felt the corner of her mouth lift before she could stop it. "The beans are coming up," she said, "if no one tramples them." "I will tell the hands to walk around the south side," he said, and finished his coffee. The fourth week was when everything shifted. It started with the rain, which came in on a Tuesday evening as a real plains thunderstorm, the kind that makes the sky black from horizon to horizon and turns the road to mud in 10 minutes. Rebecca was still at the ranch when it hit. She had been working on the household accounts, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger while the hands had their supper, and by the time she was done the rain had come in hard and the road to town was impossible. Cornelius appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been out checking the horses and was wet through, his dark hair flattened against his forehead, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You cannot ride back tonight," he said. "I am aware," she said. "The spare room upstairs is clean." He said it in the same tone he used for ranch logistics, practical and without implication. "You can send word to Mrs. Pratt with Dutch in the morning." Rebecca looked at him. She thought about the propriety of it, and then she thought about the fact that Cornelius Sutton had never given her a single reason to consider anything but propriety when she was around him, and that the road was 12 inches of mud, and that she had no other option. "Thank you," she said. The spare room was small and clean, and had a window that faced east, which meant morning light. Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the rain and thought about Thomas, which she did in the evenings more than she would have admitted. She thought about what Thomas would say about her situation, about the ranch, about the work. Thomas had been a gentle man, an earnest man, and he would have been glad she had found something solid, she thought. He would have liked that she had not broken. She was still sitting there thinking when a knock came at the door. She opened it. Cornelius stood in the hall with a glass of water and a small lamp. "I forgot to leave you a light," he said. She took the lamp. Their fingers came close but did not touch, both of them careful. "Thank you," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary. The rain was still loud on the roof. "Mrs. Covington," he said, "I wanted to say the work you have done here, the kitchen and the accounts and the garden, it is more than I hired for. I want you to know it is noticed." She looked at him. There was something different in his voice. He was not talking about the ranch now, not really, and they both knew it. "The work is what we agreed on," she said. "I know, I am saying it is more than that." He paused. "I am not good at saying things. I am better at doing them, but I wanted to say it." "You are doing all right," she said softly, and meant it. And there was a breath between them where everything was possible and nothing was committed. And then he said good night, and she closed the door and leaned against it in the lamplight, and felt the warmth of it move through her from the chest outward, and told herself that she was simply grateful to work for a fair man. She did not quite convince herself. In the morning the rain had passed, and the world outside was clean and bright, and smelled of wet grass and fresh earth. Rebecca came down early and started the stove and had coffee on before anyone else was up, and when Cornelius came in from the barn he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her at the stove and did not move for a moment, just looked, with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something pleasant and has not yet decided how to receive it. "Good morning, Mr. Sutton," she said, not turning around. "Good morning, Mrs. Covington," he said, and came and sat down, and things were both exactly the same as they always were and fundamentally different, in the way that is both the slowest and the fastest thing. It was Dutch who moved things along, inadvertently, on the following Thursday. Dutch was not a man who meddled. He had established this position over 50 years of living by keeping to his own acre of ground and expecting others to do the same. But he was also a man who had been watching two people be determinedly sensible about something that was not going to remain sensible indefinitely, and he had decided that some kinds of patience were just delay dressed up politely. He found Cornelius at the water trough and said, without preamble, "You are going to lose her if you keep standing still." Cornelius turned from the trough. "Dutch." "I am not saying it again," Dutch said, and walked off toward the barn. Cornelius stood at the water trough for a long time after that. The truth was he had been thinking about it. He had been thinking about it more than he was comfortable admitting, because he was a man who trusted what he could count and measure, and what he could not count and measure made him careful. He had measured his situation carefully. Rebecca Covington was employed by him. She was recently widowed and navigating something difficult, and he did not want to be one more thing she had to navigate. He had told himself these things repeatedly, and they were all true. What was also true was that she had been working on his ranch for 3 weeks, and in that time she had organized his pantry and his accounts, and planted beans in his kitchen garden, and argued him into shopping at Donnelly's and given his dog, whose name was Red, and who had not shown much interest in anyone since the previous cook left, a piece of salt pork on the second day that had resulted in Red now following her from the kitchen to the garden and back, with a devotion that Dutch considered embarrassing for a cattle dog. What was also true was that she was remarkable. She was clear-eyed and steady and funny in a dry way that took him by surprise, and was better because of that. She was kind to Clara without turning it into a performance. She was honest with him about the accounts in a way that cost her nothing professionally and required a kind of directness that not many people maintained with their employer. She had walked 2 miles in the heat to ask him for work as if she were conferring a favor on him by asking, and she had been right. He was in trouble, and he had known it for at least 10 days. He went to find her in the kitchen garden, where she was on her knees in the dirt doing something to the bean rows, her bonnet pushed back on her head, the late afternoon sun warm across her shoulders. "Mrs. Covington," he said. She looked up. Read something in his face. "Yes," she said. He crouched down to her level, which was not a thing a man did when he was maintaining a strictly professional posture, and they were close enough now that the words could be quiet. "I want to take you to dinner in town," he said. "On Saturday. I want to take you and Clara to the eating house on 3rd Street, not as your employer, as," he paused, working through it, "as a man who would like to have dinner with you." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were dirty from the garden, and she was aware of this in a way she normally was not. "That is a significant distinction," she said. "I know it is," he said, "and my being employed by you." "I know that too," he said. "I am not pretending it is not complicated. I am saying that I would like to have dinner with you on Saturday, and that I am asking plainly, and if you would rather not, I will not ask again, and I will not let it change anything here." "Will you be able to manage that?" she said. "If I say no, not letting it change things." "I am an honest man, Mrs. Covington. Yes, I will be able to manage it." He paused. "But I would rather not have to." She looked at him for another moment. The beans moved slightly in a small wind. Red sat at the edge of the garden and panted. "Clara will want to order pie," she said. He understood immediately that this was a yes. "That seems reasonable," he said. "All right then," she said. He stood up. She turned back to her beans. He went to the barn. Pete, who had been extremely interested in a piece of fence near the garden for the past several minutes, straightened up and went back to work with the expression of a man who had just confirmed everything he had suspected and felt deeply satisfied about it. Saturday came with the particular clarity of late spring, the sky a flat blue, and the air dry and warm without being punishing. Rebecca wore her best dress, which was a dark blue cotton she had been saving for important occasions, and she braided Clara's hair and tied it with a ribbon that Clara had already found and demanded. Clara was in very high spirits because she had been told about pie and had talked about very little else for 2 days. Cornelius Sutton came to the front door of Rebecca's house in town at 6 in the evening. He had shaved. His hair had been cut, which suggested some planning. He was wearing a clean dark shirt and his best hat, and he looked like a man who was trying without appearing to try too hard, which was its own kind of charm. Clara opened the door before Rebecca could reach it. "Oh," Clara said, "are you taking us to dinner?" "I am," Cornelius said. "Mama said there is pie." "I believe there is." Clara considered this. "I like you," she announced, and turned and went back inside, calling for her coat. Cornelius met Rebecca's eyes over the top of Clara's head as the little girl disappeared into the house. Rebecca pressed her lips together, trying not to smile, and failed entirely. "She is direct," Cornelius said. "She comes by it honestly," Rebecca said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked to the eating house together, Clara skipping slightly ahead, and the people of Caldwell who happened to see them noted it in the way small towns do, with interest and without great surprise, as though this was the natural end of something that had been moving in this direction all along. Dinner was easy in a way that surprised Rebecca. She had expected it to be awkward, the first social context outside the ranch, but Cornelius at a dinner table without the structure of the workday was still simply Cornelius, quiet and present and attentive in a way that she had come to recognize as specifically his. He asked Clara questions about school with what appeared to be genuine interest, and Clara, who was a child of good instincts, answered him as if he were a person who mattered, which was how she treated everyone until they demonstrated otherwise. Rebecca had a piece of roasted chicken and green beans and fresh bread, and she ate all of it, which she realized halfway through was the first time in 4 months she had eaten a full meal without calculating what it cost. She looked at this thought for a moment and set it carefully to one side. Clara had apple pie and ate it with the seriousness of ceremony. "This was very good," Clara said when she was done, looking at Cornelius as if awarding a verdict. "I am glad," he said. "Can we do it again?" "Clara," Rebecca said. "I would like to," Cornelius said. He walked them home afterward. Clara fell asleep on her feet halfway back, and Cornelius lifted her without discussion, the way practical people resolve practical problems, and carried her the rest of the way. Rebecca walked beside him with Clara's head on his shoulder and the warm night around them, and she thought of several things she could say, and said none of them because they were all true, and the moment did not require them. At the door he set Clara down gently, and she stirred but did not wake. "I will see you Monday," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the dark. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "Both of you." She watched him walk back toward the road, his boots quiet on the dirt path, and she stood in the doorway until she could no longer see him in the dark. Then she carried Clara inside and put her to bed and sat in the kitchen in the lamplight and allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of what was happening to her, which was considerable. The weeks that followed were a kind of slow blooming. He continued to employ her and she continued to work, and both of them were careful about those facts, because they mattered. She was not a woman who confused professional dignity with personal feeling, and he was not a man who abused an employee's position. But the dinners became a Saturday regular. He began to stop in the kitchen in the evenings, not hovering, but lingering, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and talking with her while she finished her end-of-day tasks. And these conversations ranged far and wide in the way of conversations between two people who find each other genuinely interesting. He told her about the ranch, about the 3 cattle drives he had worked before he bought his own land, about the years he had spent learning the land's tempers and what it asked of you in return for what it gave. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 5, with a father who farmed and a mother who died when he was 11. And he had left at 17 and worked his way west and never regretted it, though he sometimes thought about Missouri in October when the light was right. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, and about the school she had loved and the father who had encouraged her to read anything she could get her hands on, which in Medina County in the 1860s had not been a limitless selection, but had been enough to form a habit. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social, about the first year of their marriage which had been good, about the surveys Thomas did across Kansas, and the way he had come home with mud on his boots and stories about the land he had walked. She talked about Thomas without apology or excessive grief, the way of a person who has loved someone and lost them, and integrated it into the truth of their life without being destroyed by it. He listened to all of it with that specific quality of attention she had noticed from the beginning, the kind that said, "I am here. I am not thinking about anything else," and she found it impossible not to talk to him, which was new. She had spent the 4 months since Thomas died mostly keeping her own counsel, because the conversations available to her had been either pitying or practical, and this was neither. Clara had adopted him by this point with the ruthless efficiency of a 7-year-old who has made a decision. She came to the ranch on Saturdays now, when Mrs. Pratt had her church commitments, and she followed Cornelius around the property with the focused attention of a puppy, asking questions about everything. He answered them all, and she rewarded him with the exclusive respect of a child who believes you are worth talking to, which Pete said was more than she gave most people. Pete had become a kind of honorary uncle to Clara in the way of young men who are not old enough to be wise, but are kind enough to be useful. He had taught her how to braid a length of rope into something decorative, and she had given it to her mother, who had put it on the kitchen windowsill at home and left it there. One Saturday in early June, Cornelius took Rebecca and Clara out to see the south pasture where the spring calves were. It was late morning, and the light was long and golden across the grass. And the calves were doing the things calves do in the morning, which was mostly standing close to their mothers, and occasionally deciding to run in circles for reasons known only to calves. Clara was beside herself with delight and ran along the fence line calling to them until Cornelius opened the gate and let her in with the patient instruction that she must walk slowly and make no sudden moves. Rebecca watched from the fence, her arms resting on the top rail, watching her daughter move carefully among the calves with an expression on her face that was pure unguarded happiness, and she felt the afternoon like a physical thing, like sun on open skin. Cornelius came and stood beside her at the fence. "She is not afraid of much," he said. "She was not afraid when Thomas died," Rebecca said. "She cried and she asked her questions and then she kept going. I think she manages things better than I do." "You manage things very well," he said. "I manage things by staying busy," she said. "That is not the same thing." He considered this. "Maybe not," he said, "but the result looks similar from the outside." She looked at him. He was watching Clara in the pasture, the clean profile of him against the blue June sky. "Cornelius," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they were both aware of it. He turned and looked at her. Something shifted. "Rebecca," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Clara's voice came across the pasture calling something about a spotted calf. The warm June wind moved through the grass. Red lay in the shade of the fence post. "I should tell you," he said carefully, "that my intentions are honorable. I want to be clear about that because of the situation with the work and the ranch." "I know your intentions are honorable," she said. "You have not done a single thing in 2 months that was anything other than honorable." "I want to be more than your employer," he said. "I want to be clear about that too." She looked at him for a long moment. The June light was very kind to him, she thought, or perhaps he was simply kind and the light was making that visible. "So do I," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the fence rail, carefully, as if it were something worth handling carefully. She turned her hand and held his. They stood like that at the fence in the June afternoon while Clara discovered the spotted calf and named it immediately, at considerable volume, Henry. After that, things moved with the momentum of things that have been patient long enough. He courted her properly, which was the word and the way of 1878, and he did it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He called on her at her house in town on Sunday evenings, bringing Clara a small thing when he came, nothing extravagant, a paper of peppermint candy, a smooth river stone she had mentioned admiring, a small book of pressed wildflowers from the east pasture that he had made himself with a thoroughness that suggested it had taken some time. He did not pretend the gift was an accident. He handed it to her directly and let it be what it was. Rebecca received his calls with the particular composure of a woman who is genuinely moved and is not yet sure how much of that to show. She made coffee and they sat on the porch when the evenings were warm, which they were increasingly in June, and Clara sat with them and talked until she ran out of things to say, which took a while, and then fell asleep in her chair and had to be carried in. One evening when Clara was asleep and the coffee was done and the night sounds of Caldwell were settling around them, Cornelius said, "The bank note on this house, how much is left on it?" Rebecca went still. "That is not a small question," she said. "I know." "I am asking it anyway." She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them, and there was nothing in his expression of pity or condescension, only the honest attention of a man who wants to understand the full picture. She told him. The amount, the date, the specifics. She told him because it was the truth, and because she had learned over these weeks that this was a man who could hold information without distorting it. He was quiet for a moment after she told him. Then he said, "The wages I am paying you will cover it by September." "You calculated that already?" "Yes," she said. "Then you do not need me to solve it," he said. "You are already solving it." She let out a breath she had been holding without knowing it. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to say," he said slowly, "that if you wanted to, if things went the way I hope they go, you would not have to solve it alone." She looked at him. He looked at her. "That is not a small thing to say," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 weeks. I wanted to say it correctly." "You said it correctly," she said. He moved his chair closer to hers, the slight scrape of wood on porch boards, and took her hand in the dark. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her with everything on his face that he usually kept in reserve, all of it, and she found it was not alarming at all. It was only true. He kissed her there on the porch in the dark, once, slow and careful, and she kissed him back. And it was the kind of beginning that feels like it has always been coming toward you, like a horizon you have been walking toward without knowing it. July brought heat and cattle, and the steady rhythms of a ranch in summer. Rebecca's garden was fully up now, the beans and tomatoes and squash coming in enough that she was putting up preserves in the spare jars she had found in the cellar. The kitchen at Sutton Ranch smelled throughout July of the particular good smell of things being canned and stored, and the hands treated the preserve shelf with a reverence that Rebecca found quietly amusing. Pete in particular had developed a preference for the tomato preserves that he would spread on everything if given the opportunity. Clara came to the ranch 3 days a week through the summer. She had by July essentially claimed Bess the mare as her own, with Cornelius's quiet permission, and she was learning to ride in the south paddock with Pete's patient instruction. Rebecca watched from the fence and felt two things simultaneously: the ordinary worry of a mother watching a child on a horse, and something else, something larger and warmer, which was the sight of her daughter learning something new in a place that was becoming, gradually, home. She thought about this word, home, and let herself think it. Cornelius had said nothing further along the lines of the porch conversation, which she understood was because he was giving her room to arrive at things in her own time. He was not a man who pushed. She had noticed this was one of his particular qualities, the ability to be patient not passively but actively, in the way of someone who is genuinely confident that good things do not require forcing. She came to it on a Tuesday morning in mid-July when she was in the kitchen garden before sunrise, harvesting beans in the cool of the morning with dew still on the leaves, and she understood with a completeness that did not require argument that she was in love with Cornelius Sutton. Not gratitude, not admiration, not the comfortable warmth of a person you trust. Love, the real variety, which she had experienced once before and knew how to recognize. She sat back on her heels in the bean row and said, to the beans and to the morning, "Well, there it is." Then she got up and took her beans inside and started breakfast, and when Cornelius came in from the barn at 6, she looked at him and smiled, the full smile, the one she did not usually deploy without reason, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at her with an expression of such transparent gladness that she almost laughed. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He sat down and she brought him coffee, and their fingers touched when she set it down, and neither of them moved away. "I need to talk to you after breakfast," she said. "All right," he said. She waited until the hands had gone out and the kitchen was quiet, and then she came and sat across from him at the table, and she said, looking at him directly because she was a woman who did not approach important things sideways, "I am in love with you. I wanted to say it before you had to wonder about it any longer." Cornelius looked at her. For a moment he was absolutely still. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice had something in it she had never heard from him before, something that went under everything else and was the real thing. "You do not need to say anything immediately," she said, starting to be careful, starting to build the small shelter of qualification. "I love you," he said simply, completely, and she stopped building. "Oh," she said, "I have been trying to say it correctly for 2 weeks," he said. "There is apparently no way to say it other than just saying it." "That seems right," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you and Clara to be here. I want to build something with you, not just employ you to manage something I built before you came. I want it to be ours." He paused. "I am asking you, not assuming." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the July morning light, the table she had scrubbed, and the kitchen she had organized, and the garden outside the window she had planted. And she thought of the biscuits and the accounts, and the November evening when Mrs. Pratt's child was sick, and she had arrived with Clara at his back door, and he had said she is welcome without hesitation. And she thought of Clara on Bess in the south paddock, and Pete making faces across the dinner table, and Dutch's flat approving nod, and the evening on the porch in the dark, and all of the gradual, genuine, unhurried accumulation of a man and a woman learning each other truly. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her face in his work-hardened hands with the infinite care of a man handling something he knows is the most valuable thing he has ever been given. And he kissed her in the July kitchen in the morning light, and she held onto his shirt with both hands and kissed him back, and it was everything. Clara, who had been listening from the hallway because she was 7 and had excellent instincts about when things were happening, came around the door and said, "Are we staying here?" They pulled apart, though not far. Cornelius looked down at Clara. "Would you like to?" he said. Clara looked at him, then at her mother, then around the kitchen with the comprehensive assessment of a child deciding on the merits. "Yes," she said. "Henry the calf is here." "That is a good reason," he said. "And you are nice," Clara added. "And Mama smiles more." Rebecca reached down and pulled Clara against her side, and Cornelius put his hand on Rebecca's back, and the three of them stood in the kitchen together in the July morning, and it was the simplest and most complete thing. Pete appeared at the back door needing something about a fence post, and took in the scene and retreated without speaking, which was the most tactful thing he had done in his 22 years. They were married on the 17th of August, 1878, in the small Methodist church on 2nd Street in Caldwell. Rebecca wore the blue dress she had worn to dinner that first Saturday, because it was her best, and she was a practical woman. But she had added a collar of cream lace that had belonged to her mother, and she wore her hair down for the first time since Thomas had died, the dark auburn of it catching the August light through the church windows, and there was not a person in the church who could say she was anything other than beautiful. Cornelius stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had made in Wichita 2 weeks prior, and he watched her walk up the aisle and looked at her the way a man looks at the thing that has changed the shape of his life, with complete attention and something close to wonder. Clara was flower girl. She had selected marigolds from the kitchen garden for this purpose, with consultation from Pete, and she walked down the aisle scattering them with a focused seriousness that made several people in the pews smile. Dutch was there in his good shirt, seated at the end of a pew with the expression of a man who has not been to a wedding in a very long time and is discovering he does not mind it. The Fowler brothers were there in a state of perpetual confusion but earnest attendance. Pete cried, which he later denied, and which everyone else agreed not to mention. The vows were simple. The preacher said the words, and they said the words, and when it was done, Cornelius held her hand and looked at her, and what was in his eyes was not the end of something but the settled, certain beginning. They walked out of the church into the August sunshine together, Clara between them holding their hands, and the town of Caldwell, which did not make room easily but did make room eventually, gave them the day. The bank note on Rebecca's house in town was paid off in September, as she had calculated, from the wages she had earned. She made the payment herself, which Cornelius had understood she needed to do, and she walked out of the bank with the paid papers in her hand, and felt the weight that had been on her since February lift and dissolve into the September air. She stood on the boardwalk in the blue September morning and breathed, and she thought of Thomas with clear, steady love and said, in her heart, "I am all right. We are all right." She had moved to the ranch in mid-August, and the house in town had been taken over by Mrs. Pratt's eldest daughter, who needed it and who Rebecca had arranged the rental for personally because it was the right thing, and because she had means to do right things now. The kitchen garden at the ranch was fully producing, and she had put up 32 jars of preserves, and intended at least 10 more before the first frost. The household accounts showed 3 months of careful management, and the numbers were clean and they were building, adding to what was already there. Clara had her own room at the ranch, with a window that looked out toward the south pasture, and she had decorated it with the river stone and the pressed wildflower book, and a drawing of Henry the calf that was, charitably, recognizable. She had started the new school year in September still at the school in Caldwell, and she rode in with Rebecca on Bess in the mornings, which Clara found very satisfying from a social prestige standpoint. Autumn came to the Kansas plains with the full drama of the season, the grasses going gold and copper, the sky widening and deepening in the way of autumn skies, the first cold nights reminding everything that winter had opinions. The cattle drives had passed their peak, and the Kishom Trail was quieting down for the year. The work shifted to the preparations of a working ranch for winter, fence checks and hay storage, and the 100 small tasks that kept a property whole through the cold months. Cornelius and Rebecca worked alongside each other with the ease of people who have found their rhythm together. She had taken over the ranch accounts completely by October, managing the books with the precision she had applied to her own finances, and the ranch's numbers were tidier than they had been in years. He told her this plainly, without making a ceremony of it, in the way he had learned was what she preferred, and she received it the same way. They talked in the evenings the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's thinking. About the ranch and its future, about the spring calves expected in February, about whether to take on more land to the east, about Clara's reading, which was coming along considerably better now that she had access to the small collection of books Cornelius kept in his study, and that she had begun treating as her personal library with his quiet encouragement. He had ordered 2 new ones from a catalog in Wichita, a collection of natural history and a geography, because Clara had mentioned the world was large, and she intended to know more of it. "You spoil her," Rebecca said one evening, not entirely seriously, watching him read to Clara from the natural history book while Clara followed along with her finger. "She asks good questions," he said. "She asks relentless questions." "Same thing," he said, and turned the page. Rebecca looked at them together, her daughter and her husband, in the lamplight of the evening, and felt the fullness of it settle into her bones like warmth. She had earned this. She thought it was important to know that. Not that luck had not been involved, and not that she had not needed someone solid to build with, but that she had not waited for rescue. She had walked 2 miles in the spring heat and asked plainly for work and been given it, and everything that had grown from that moment had grown because both of them had been willing to tend it. She thought about what Cornelius had said to her once, not long after they married, when she had thanked him for hiring her that first day. He had looked at her with a slight frown and said, "You came to me, Rebecca. You asked. I only said yes." And she had thought about that, about the distinction, about what it meant that he remembered it that way, and she had loved him more for it. The first snow came in November, earlier than usual, and the ranch was quiet under it in the way of things that have prepared themselves and settled into rest. Clara stood at the window of her room calling down to Rebecca in the yard that it was snowing, as if reporting an event of historic significance, and Rebecca looked up at her daughter's face in the window, pink-cheeked and luminous, and called back up that yes, she could see, and then threw a handful of snow because it was the first snow and you had to, and Clara shrieked with delight and disappeared to find her coat. Cornelius came around the corner of the house and found Rebecca with snow on her coat, laughing. "The south fence needs looking at before it gets heavy," he said, and then looked at her laughing face in the first snow and put away the fence for a moment. "Come on," she said, and threw snow at him. He caught it on the chest and looked at her. "Rebecca, Clara is coming," she said. "You had better be ready." Clara came through the back door at a run in her coat and hat, already scooping, and Cornelius was ready. The snow fight lasted 20 minutes and ended with all 3 of them inside by the stove, Clara explaining in detail who had won, which was herself, and Rebecca making hot coffee and the kitchen warm with all of them in it, and outside the snow coming down soft and steady across the Kansas plains. By December, Rebecca knew she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a Sunday evening, sitting by the fire in the main room while Clara was upstairs with her books, and she watched his face as the information landed, watched the sequence of it, the surprise, and then the recognition of what the surprise contained, and then the slow, certain gladness coming up from somewhere deep. He took her hands. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" he said, which was the first thing, his first concern being her. "I am well," she said. "I checked with Dr. Hensley. Everything is where it should be." "Good," he said. He held her hands. "Rebecca." "I know," she said. "I am," he said, and stopped because there was apparently no word large enough. "I know," she said again, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat by the fire in the December evening and were quiet with it together. When they told Clara, her reaction was immediate and comprehensive. "Is it a girl?" Clara said. "We do not know yet," Rebecca said. "I would like a sister," Clara said, "but a brother would be acceptable if he is not annoying." "We will see what we can do," Cornelius said. "Can we name it Henry if it is a boy?" "That name is taken," Rebecca said. "The calf will not mind sharing." "We will think about names," Rebecca said firmly, and Clara accepted this as a reasonable position and went back to her book. Winter passed in the way of winters on the Kansas plains, cold and necessary, and full of the particular indoor intimacy of people who share a house and cannot be outdoors much and must find how to inhabit the same space with comfort. They found this easily. The evenings were long and warm, and there was much to talk about and much to simply be quiet about, which is its own kind of compatibility. Cornelius was reading more. Rebecca had found this out when she noticed the natural history book had company on the study shelf, and then more company, and she had smiled at this because it was the evidence of something opening in him, something that had always been there, but had perhaps needed the invitation of a household that valued it. He found her one January evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the household accounts and a piece of paper on which she had been doing calculations beyond the ordinary accounts, longer projections, spring costs and summer wages, and estimated income from the calves to be sold in the fall. He sat down across from her and looked at the paper. "Planning ahead," he said. "Always," she said. He looked at the numbers. "The East land," he said. "If we took the option on it in the spring." "Here," she said, and turned the paper and showed him a column. He studied it. She had run the numbers 3 ways, conservatively, moderately, and optimistically, and even the conservative numbers said the East land was a sound investment in the 4th year. "The 4th year is a long time to be conservative," he said. "The 4th year is when it starts to return," she said. "Years 1 through 3 we are building. That is different." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You want the East land," he said. "I think it is right for the ranch," she said. "But it is your decision." "It is our ranch," he said. "Our decision." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the paper and said, "Then I think we should take the option in March." "So do I," he said. He got up and came around the table and kissed her on the top of her head in the unself-conscious way of a man who is entirely comfortable in the expression of tenderness, and went back to his reading, and she went back to her numbers, and it was one of the most domestic moments of her life and also one of the happiest. Spring came back to Kansas in the full and confident way of things that have never had reason to doubt themselves. The first calves arrived in February, strong ones, 7 of them in the first week, and Cornelius walked back into the house after the 3rd night of checking on them with mud on his boots, and a smile that he did not try to suppress. "7," he said. "I heard you come in," she said. She was 8 months along now and moving more carefully, the familiar weight of late pregnancy, and she had accepted this with the practicality she applied to everything, adjusting her work patterns without complaint. 7 strong calves," he said, 2 spotted ones. "Henry will have company," she said. "He will," he said. He came and sat beside her at the table, and she gave him the coffee she had been keeping warm, and he drank it and looked at her with the particular expression she had learned was his version of contentment, measured and certain and deep. "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said, "and uncomfortable, mostly ready." "Doctor Hensley is in town." "I know where Dr. Hensley is," she said. He put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand and held his, the now familiar shape of it. "Everything is going to be fine," he said. "I know," she said. "It usually is when you are prepared." He laughed, a full, quiet laugh, and she smiled at the sound of it because she had discovered she was a person who could make him laugh, and she liked this about herself and about them. The baby came on the 2nd of March, 1879, with Dr. Hensley in attendance and Clara in the kitchen with Dutch, who had been recruited to keep her company, and who was managing the situation with the stoic competence of a man entirely out of his depth who was not going to show it. The baby was a boy. He arrived in the early morning, loud and determined about it, and Cornelius was there, which had not been the absolute custom of the time, but which was the custom of this particular household, and Rebecca put the baby into his hands and watched his face. Cornelius Sutton held his son in the first pale light of a March morning, and looked at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely undone. And Rebecca lay back against the pillow, and watched her husband become a father, and felt the whole of her life present in the room with her. Thomas and Ohio, and the walk down the road to this ranch a year ago with her chin up and her hands balled at her sides. And the kitchen garden and the accounts and the first snow and the evening on the porch in the dark, all of it, present and accounted for and leading directly to this. Clara was brought in. She looked at the baby with great intensity. "He is small," she said. "You were smaller," Rebecca said. "What is his name?" Clara said. Rebecca looked at Cornelius. They had discussed names. They had a list. "Thomas," Cornelius said. "Thomas Cornelius Sutton." Rebecca pressed her lips together and her eyes went bright. Clara considered this. "That is Papa's name," she said. "Yes," Cornelius said. Clara looked at the baby with a different expression, more serious and more settled. "Hello, Thomas," she said. The baby, who was not yet interested in greetings, made his opinion known in the only vocabulary available to him, which was loud and carried. "He is annoying," Clara observed. "He is very new," Rebecca said. "Give him time." Clara accepted this as reasonable and sat down on the edge of the bed to wait. Summer came back again, and with it the trail drives and the dust and the particular energy of Caldwell in the drive season, and the Sutton Ranch received it from a position of solidity. The East Land had been optioned in March and they had begun working it in April, the fence lines going up straight and clean, and the calves of this year were promising, and the kitchen garden was double what it had been the year before because Rebecca had planned for it with characteristic thoroughness. Thomas was growing in the loud and emphatic way of healthy boys, and Clara had arrived at a guarded affection for him that she expressed mainly through monitoring his behavior with great seriousness, and occasionally bringing him things to look at, which he received with appreciation. Pete had fallen in a tentative way for one of the daughters of a family who ranched to the north, a quiet girl named Helen who came to church every Sunday, and Dutch had observed this with the air of a man who had expected it and felt no need to comment. The Fowler brothers remained perpetually confused but loyal, which was sufficient. On an evening in late June, Rebecca stood at the fence of the south pasture where she had stood a year ago when Cornelius had crouched down and asked her to dinner, and this time she stood alone, because Cornelius was putting Clara to bed and Thomas was asleep in his cradle inside, and the evening was warm and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the sky was the full soft purple of a June sunset over the plains. She thought about a morning a little over a year ago when she had walked down a road with her chin up and her hands balled at her sides, and everything balanced on the single narrow fact of what she could do and what she was willing to do. She thought about the difference between what she had been afraid of and what had actually happened. She thought about dignity and work and the particular truth that the hardest step she had ever taken had led directly to everything she had. She had not asked for charity. She had never wanted charity. She had wanted to work, and she had been given work, and in being given it, she had also been given the chance to show someone what she was, and he had been paying such close attention that he had seen it, all of it, and he had not looked away. The back door of the house opened and Cornelius came across the yard toward her, his boots on the dry June grass, and he came to the fence and stood beside her the way he had stood there before. "Clara wants to know if she can have a horse of her own," he said. "She already has Bess. Bess is technically the ranch's horse. Clara has made a legal argument. Clara is 7. She is 8 as of November," he said, and the argument was surprisingly sound. Rebecca looked at him. He was watching the pasture with the expression he wore when he was trying not to smile, which was one of her favorite expressions, and she felt the warmth of it in the way she had felt the warmth of everything here, accumulated and layered and completely real. "We will discuss it," she said. "I thought you would say that," he said. She leaned against his arm and he put his arm around her, and they stood together at the fence in the June evening looking out over the land that was theirs. The south pasture with the cattle and the east fields that were coming into their first full season, and the barn and the bunkhouse and the house behind them with the lamp in the window and the 2 children inside who were the absolute center of everything they had built. "Cornelius," she said. "Rebecca," he said. "I am very glad I walked down that road," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man receiving something important and attending to it properly. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The purple sky deepened toward dark, and the first stars came out over Kansas, the wide, flat sky full of them, the way it had always been and would go on being, indifferent and beautiful over the particular small, extraordinary life of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of it and held on. In the house, Thomas woke briefly and then settled. Clara had gone to sleep with the geography book open on her pillow. Pete was writing a careful letter to Helen with considerable revision. Dutch sat on the bunkhouse steps and smoked his pipe and looked at the same stars with the satisfaction of a man who has watched things turn out right, and found that he minds the witnessing of it less than he used to. At the fence, Cornelius and Rebecca stayed until the full dark came in, and the night sounds of the summer prairie surrounded them, and neither of them moved to go inside yet, because they were both people who had learned, in their different ways, not to leave a good thing before it was done. When they finally went in, closing the door against the dark, the house received them the way good houses do, with the warmth of the fire and the smell of the evening meal and the particular settled quiet of a home that has been genuinely lived in, and they moved through it together with the ease of 2 people who are each other's home now, not by accident or desperation or charity, but by choice, made clearly, and kept every day since. Rebecca Covington had walked into Sutton Ranch asking for work, and Cornelius Sutton had spent the following month, and every month after that, learning what she had already known, that there was a very great difference between what a person needs and what a person deserves, and that the wisest thing a man could do when a woman showed him her full worth was to make very sure he was equal to it. He had spent the rest of his life trying to be, and she had spent the rest of her life beside him while he did, which was both the simplest and most significant thing either of them had ever undertaken, and they undertook it well.